I guess just starting with this question, is digital addiction even a real thing? Some of you are nodding immediately yes, and it could be because you have real experience with this. Some of you might not be so sure. What is becoming abundantly clear is how ubiquitous digital technology and digital media has become in all of our lives, that it's everywhere. And the usage of digital technology and digital media is showing no sign of slowing down in terms of use and exposure, and I doubt it will over time. This is a 2019 digital use survey put out by Common Sense Media, which is, I find, a useful resource for those maybe in a ministry field, but also I think for anyone who's concerned, but also concerned parents, just to be informed about just some of the trends around media use. But the media use survey, I won't share all of it. It's fairly extensive. You can read it online if you want to. But some of the things it pointed out was, which I found interesting, did a survey of media use among tweens, which would be 8 to 12-year-olds, and teens, which would be 13 to 19-year-olds, as far as just how many hours a day of media use is being recorded. There's the breakdown for tweens right there, but 15% of tweens, so 8 to 12-year-olds, indicated using more than 8 hours a day. Among teens, that number rose to 29%. That's the part that really surprised me. So on average, though, the average in those age demographics is that 4.4 hours and 7.2 hours of digital media use. Now, what needs to be noted about that is that doesn't include media use for things like school or work. This is just like, social media, video games, that kind of stuff. Movies or TV shows. So interesting. Anyway, so the average is 7.2 hours. If you do the math on that, it adds up pretty quickly. I think in the course of, I know for they did some surveying on gaming addiction in particular, and for young men who gamed 10 hours a day, they were considered to have a bit of a gaming addiction. But in the course of 3 years, they basically used as many hours as it would take them to acquire a bachelor's degree. There's a good example of trading time for time. One thing that has definitely taken an uptick in recent years is in terms of online video viewing. And this won't surprise any of you. It's just some of the realities. But between 2015 and 2019, so the course of 4 years, video viewing, in particular YouTube, just about doubled, both between tweens and teens, in terms of usage and time spent watching videos, just videos online, on YouTube primarily. YouTube is now, among Gen Zs in particular, it's now slated as the #1 used media source online. And in fact, a survey done in, I think also 2019, on a learning method survey showed that I think it was about 72% of Gen Zs, so they would be, some of you would be Gen Zs, cited YouTube as their #1 method of learning. Interesting. It's just a changing world. Trends are continuing in terms of smartphone ownership. The majority of kids owning smartphones, so majority being 50% or more, moved from age 13 in 2015, that's when the majority owned a cell phone or a smartphone, down to 11 by year 2019. And there are the climbing percentages. So in 2015, if you were 18 years old, 77% of you would have owned a smartphone. Today, it's 91%. I guess no surprises. More surprising are 11-year-olds. I don't know why 20% of 11-year-olds have a smartphone. Again, a different day. So there's no question that, again, media usage, digital exposure, it's on the increase. It's just the reality of the world we find ourselves in. The question is, but is it an addiction? Or can it become an addiction? And the research I did on this, again, I'm just going to try and be as objective as I can. I don't have a particular agenda here other than to try and discern as believers what's best. Is it an addiction? It depends on who you ask. And it depends on how you define addiction. You might not find that surprising, right? It depends. The studies, there are tons of studies. There are lots of experts. And there are many varying conclusions. But there are some things that have been consistently stated in the findings that I find very interesting and telling. Here's what scientists have found out. Whether or not they'll call it an addiction or not, here's what they have discovered. They have determined that digital stimulation from things like games, social media, videos, etc. They've determined through brain imaging technology that it involves stimulation of the same reward center of the brain as does alcohol or pot use or sex. So we know enough about the brain and how it works now to understand that one of the great appeals of social media is that it offers a reward. Just as many other addiction-forming substances or activities might. Does that mean it's addictive? Well, again, it kind of depends how you define it. But that's what they have determined. So there's something physiologically going on in your brain when you engage in certain types of media use. And it does involve those kinds of reward centers. MRI studies have shown similar patterns of altered brain connectivity between cocaine and meth addicts and people being treated for internet addiction. So when they do the MRI imaging studies, they're looking at regions of the brain that show differentiation in terms of connectivity and function, and they're finding similar patterns between those kinds of and of course, meth and cocaine, particularly meth, the addictive power of meth is extreme in how it changes your brain physiologically. Now, that's not trying to scare you to say that using your cell phone has the same impact on your brain as meth does. That would be overstating it terribly, I think. But it's interesting that they are seeing similar patterns in altered brain connectivity. Internet gaming addictions have shown changes to the orbitofrontal cortex, similar to those seen in people with obsessive compulsive disorders. And that orbitofrontal cortex, that's the region of the brain which modulates things like risk-taking. So again, there's these similar patterns that they're noticing. Again, is it conclusive? It's hard to say it's conclusive because when you look at similarities in patterns, those are correlations. Whether they're causative is a whole other, it's difficult to determine, rather, right? But there's these correlations that seem to be quite uncanny. They found that heavy online gamers, they have found that those who online game 10 hours a day or more do display noted shrinkage in brain gray matter. There is a definite change in the structure of the brain and the amount of gray matter in particular. Dr. Frances Jensen wrote a great book called The Teenage Brain. Yeah, she's really smart. She's like the head of neuroscience at Boston University University Hospital, and she teaches at Harvard neuroscience. If you're a parent, this is a really good read. If you have a brain, this would be a good read too. It's actually very informative. But in particular, it speaks about, the reason I say for parents is because her research is directly connected to the developmental brain of adolescents. And of course, what we know now is that your brains do not stop developing until you're about 25. In particular, the cerebral cortex is not fully formed and fully matured until age 25. The cerebral cortex being that portion of the brain responsible for mostly rational thought. which explains a whole lot for parents of teenagers. But it does explain why, what were you thinking, right? There's something to that the brain is not fully formed and functioning as it ought to, which again kind of speaks to God's design for the family and parents and raising, and even the community of faith, helping to raise up the next generation. There's a vulnerability. Anyway, in her book, a portion of the book she devotes to looking at technology and brain function. One of the things she observes is that the cascades of neuroprocessors that kick off the brain's reward circuitry and the rush of pleasure chemical, that's dopamine, right? When things feel good, it's your brain it's the neurotransmitter dopamine being signaling through your brain to tell you that this is good. It's a reward. That pleasure chemical dopamine can be triggered just as easily by the release of the latest iPhone as it can by alcohol or pot or sex or a rush of a fast car. So something physiological is happening. What's interesting, though, with technology use, especially around substance abuse, it doesn't require the addition of any chemical to the body. It's just conditioning your body to respond on its own, which is very interesting. So she concludes this. She says, in some ways, then, you can say technology is a drug because it's eliciting the same neurological response as some kind of addictive substance, some kind of drug use. Dr. Anna Lemke, she's the chief of Stanford's Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic, Stanford University. I try not to pick people who are just going to say the things that I want them to say in order to make a point, but people who have some credibility. Dr. Lemke said one of the most important discoveries in the field of neuroscience in the past 75 years is that pleasure and pain are processed in the same part of the brain and that the brain tries hard to keep them in balance. She wrote an article, this was an article she wrote that I read on I forget the title exactly, but it was basically, we're being saturated by dopamine, was the gist of the article's title. She said, as soon as dopamine is released, again, that's the pleasure reward neurotransmitter, the chemical of the brain, in the brain adapts to it by reducing or down-regulating the number of dopamine receptors that are stimulated. So when the stimulation happens, what she's saying is what happens after that is that the brain adjusts to downgrade or decrease the number of dopamine transmitters that can be released. This causes, she says, the brain to level out by tipping to the side of pain, which is why pleasure is usually followed by a feeling of hangover or come down. Have you ever had like an exhilarating experience, like this day was the best day ever? And the next day you're kind of like, why do I feel so down in the dumps? You ever been there? Okay, there's a reason for that. That's what she's saying, is that it's the brain's way of bringing back your brain chemistry back to what she calls homeostasis, or which is basically a leveling out. She said, under normal circumstances, she said, if we wait long enough, the feeling passes, the come down feeling passes, oh, I feel so down in the dumps. Eventually it levels out and we feel back to normal again. So if we wait long enough, that passes and neutrality is restored. She says, but there's a natural tendency to counteract it, right? When you're feeling down in the dumps, what do you tend to do? You find some stimulation that will lift you out of it. She says the tendency is to go back to the source of pleasure for another dose. Now, in general, she's describing that in general. This is science over the last 75 years. And so this brings some explanation to the patterns in addictive behavior or addictions, right? If it's a drug, it's stimulating your body to produce the pleasure response, the dopamine release. Your body's natural response, or the brain's natural response, is to bring you back to homeostasis, so it counters that, it tips it back, and in the tipping process, you're feeling low. And so what happens for the addict is that I need another hit in order to get because the pleasure, the reward is what you really want. And then that just brings you into a cycle of dependency on the reward stimulator. So your body can never get back to. Which also explains why the longer you are on, especially the harder drugs, coming off of them, if you've ever talked to anyone who's been through rehab, they can literally feel like they're dying. Because it's the body's reaction and response, in particular the brain. The point she's making in this article, though, is because of the proliferation of technology, it's so easy to get another hit. And I've been there. Facebook, maybe for some of you that's not in anymore. Apparently now it's for old people, Facebook. But the stimulation is, someone pinged me something, or someone liked my thing, or someone made a comment on there's a reward there. So what she's saying is that because of technology is so accessible, those digital rewards are always at our fingertips. What she notes, and what's interesting as well, she points out in this article, she's talking from her clinical experience with clients, but I did a little digging into the statistics as well, just to see in the last little while, particularly, I'm interested to see what's happening among the generation that's growing up with these. It's just interesting to see that in general, across our population, depression is just on kind of a continual upward trajectory. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say, and that's because of these. I think there's a lot more going on than just technology use. I think it has a lot to do with the angst of our age and so many other sociological realities and cultural realities. But I know part of it has to do with that we're continually dialed in. We're continually tuned in through our technology. What I found was really interesting, though, is that it was age 20 to 21-year-olds who showed between 2009 and 2017 the highest, almost a doubling in rates of depression. The demographic, I would argue, who've probably been the most influenced or impacted by the proliferation of technology, and in particular, these smartphones. Another study that was really interesting, again, these are all correlation kinds of things, but after a while, when you see the trends that, over and over and over again, you think something's there. But in the UK did a study on the percentage of those experiencing or reporting high levels of depression, not just like, oh, I felt blue today, but really experiencing a high level of depression as a function of hours per week on social media. And this I found very interesting. And that's basically from none on the left over to 5+ hours on the right, especially among girls, which was interesting, that pushing up towards 40%, reporting high levels of depression. There was a study done at the University of Maryland, which I thought was really interesting. This was a media fast experiment done among a cohort of students, about 1,000 students who participated. It was led by Professor Susan Moeller. 1,000 students from 12 countries around the world who were asked to take part of this technology fast and to go 24 hours with no technology, no media of any kind. So for those who were able to, they took part, and as they did so, they were supposed to write about their experiences after their 24-hour fast. So here's just some of the qualitative feedback that they got from these students. Some of the students in the United Kingdom, emptiness. This almost sounds like Solomon in Ecclesiastes. Emptiness, all is emptiness. Emptiness overwhelms me. I feel paralyzed. Wow. Students in China. I sat in my bed and stared blankly. I had nothing to do. The feeling of nothing passed into my heart. This person should be a poet. I feel like I had lost something important. In Uganda, students said, I felt like there was a problem with me. I felt so lonely. And in the United States, I went into absolute panic mode. I felt paralyzed. I felt dead. Sounds a little melodramatic, but fascinating that this is the kind of experiential reaction. Again, obviously this is all anecdotal. I don't know how scientific it is. It's a sociological study. It's not really scientific, but it is the anecdotal responses are very interesting. That just going without media for 24 hours, and these are the kinds of feelings that are being reported. But is it an addiction, or can it become addiction? Well, here's a riddle. What walks like a duck, flies like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck? Any guesses? A duck. Is it an addiction? Is it addiction forming? Well, again, it depends on who you ask and who you talk to. But as you look at the data, as you look at the research, as you look at the evidence, it sure seems like it. It sure seems like it can become an addiction, and it sure seems like people are addicted, and that what they're experiencing in response or in withdrawal, it's the exact kind of thing you would describe if you were describing withdrawal from some kind of addictive substance. Is it exactly the same? I'm not sure I would say that. But I think there's enough of the science to show that there is something physiologically going on in our brains. And of course, I haven't even really touched on that aspect of digital addiction, which we know is a problem, and that's pornography. But the research in pornography addiction, which is a form of digital addiction, is just as, if not more, revealing in terms of the physiological change going on in the brain. Right? So this isn't just personality, some people versus others. This isn't just your beliefs and how you're brought up. No, this is the hard science, because this is what's going on inside the brain physiologically. And there are changes taking place. That if it's changing the structure of your brain, if it's changing the chemistry of your brain, then it's going to change the way you think and the way you feel and the way you respond. That's just the way God's made us. We are spiritual. We are embodied spirits. We are whole beings, body, soul, heart, and mind. If one part of our being ails, the whole of our being ails. Right? So I would not equate the brain with the mind, but the two are indissolubly connected.